The mirror didn't lie, or did it? A murder hides in plain sight. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. Tell me where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. I can't wait to read everyone. Now the mystery begins. It was a morning like any other in Baker Street, that peculiar liminal hour between the last remnants of night's fog and the hesitant promise of daylight, when Holmes often conducted his quietest and most introspective rituals, examining ash from exotic tobaccos, revisiting old cases with the scrutiny of a chess master reviewing a well-played game, or, as I found him that day, strumming a melancholy air upon his violin with eyes half closed and brow creased in restless thought. "I see you've been reading the Times obituary column again," I ventured, noting the crumpled paper beside the hearth and the faint ink smudge on his right thumb. Holmes smiled faintly without turning. "Obituaries are the most honest columns in the paper, Watson." The living lie. The dead have no such need. Before I could press further, a firm knock sounded at the door. Urgent, but measured, betraying neither panic nor diffidence. Mrs. Hudson answered it swiftly, and moments later, a tall, grey-suited gentleman with a waxed moustache and a countenance of cultivated severity stood before us. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked in a clipped tone. "My name is Colonel Theophilus Armitage. I must beg your assistance with a matter of utmost delicacy and bafflement." Holmes gestured toward the armchair. "Please, Colonel, sit. You have come from the Harrington Club, I take it? Your boots bear a scuff of red brick dust not found this side of Pall Mall, and the brass key in your watch chain bears their crest." The Colonel blinked. "Well, yes, that is remarkably correct. I am one of its governors, but this is not club business, sir. It concerns a murder, a very private one." Holmes leaned forward, interest sharpening in his eyes. Armitage took a moment, as if weighing his words. "Last night, at approximately 10:30, a young man by the name of Miles Witherton was found dead in the drawing-room of his mother's townhouse at Harrington Court, just off Cavendish Square. A blade through the heart. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, and most bizarre of all, he was alone in a locked room. The only witness, if you can believe it, is a mirror." "A mirror?" I echoed. The Colonel nodded. "The body was discovered by a maid. The door was locked from the inside, the windows latched, but she claims, poor thing nearly fainted, she saw another figure in the mirror over the fireplace, a man standing behind Witherton. And yet, when she entered, the room was quite empty, save the corpse." Holmes' eyes glittered with anticipation. "And the police?" "Inspector Lestrade is handling the case, but—" Armitage gave a helpless shrug. "He believes the girl imagined it, that it was suicide. But Miles was left-handed and the wound entered from the right." Holmes shot me a sidelong glance. A wound from the wrong hand, a phantom in a mirror, and a door locked from within. A perfect little puzzle. The Colonel nodded stiffly. "Miss Judith Witherton, Miles's sister, is understandably distraught, but insists upon discretion. You were recommended by name. If you will come, a cab is waiting." Holmes was already on his feet, plucking his coat from the peg and reaching for his magnifying glass. "Watson, fetch your bag. We go to Harrington Court." As we descended the stairs and entered the waiting cab, the fog of Baker Street seemed to cling to our coats like the mystery ahead, a silent companion to our thoughts. "Holmes," I asked, as the horse clattered into motion, "do you think the maid truly saw someone in the mirror?" "I think, my dear Watson," he said, lighting a cigarette with deliberate care, "that if she saw what she says she saw, then the reflection may be more real than the room itself." And with that enigmatic remark, we were off to investigate the murder in the reflection. The cab clattered along the cobbled streets, the mist creeping like a silent accomplice around gas lamps and over wrought-iron fences. I watched Holmes in the half-light as he smoked in contemplative silence, his fingers tapping out some rhythm of thought upon his knee. We turned into Cavendish Square, where the houses stood proud and grave, their windows shuttered, their secrets tightly held. We came to a halt before a handsome white-stone townhouse, number 12, Harrington Court. It bore the dignity of old money, with its neat iron gate and the gleam of polished brass on the knocker. The colonel led us inside without a word. A tall, grim butler took our coats and gloves with the sombre precision of a man acquainted with bad news. "This way, gentlemen," said Armitage, leading us through a richly carpeted hall past oil portraits and ticking clocks until we reached a pair of wide double doors. "This is the drawing-room where Miles was found." Holmes stepped forward as the doors creaked open, revealing an opulently appointed room with high ceilings and damask curtains drawn tight against the daylight. At the far end stood the great fireplace, above which hung the mirror in question, an imposing rectangular piece framed in ornate gilt, positioned to reflect the entire room. The room bore no signs of violence. A faint scent of brandy lingered in the air, mingling with a floral perfume that seemed out of place. In the centre, a velvet armchair had been moved slightly askew. A small, dark stain marked the carpet before it. "There," said the colonel, pointing. "That's where the body was." Holmes said nothing at first. He strode forward and stood precisely where the chair was, his eyes fixed on the mirror. Then he turned slowly, surveying the room, his gaze brushing across every item. The decanter on the side table, the half-burned candle stubs on the mantel, a book of poetry left face down on the armrest. "Who last saw Mr. Witherton alive?" Holmes asked, kneeling beside the dark stain. "His sister, Judith. She says he had retired to the drawing-room shortly after dinner. He often sat here to read or sketch. She retired herself by 10. Holmes rose and moved toward the mirror. He pressed his finger against its surface, leaving no mark, then stooped to examine the wall bracket beneath it. "And the maid?" "Miss Ellen Broom. She came to collect the tray shortly after 10:30 and saw his reflection with a man standing behind him. She opened the door, found him stabbed, quite dead, and the room empty. No sign of any intruder." "No other entrance?" Holmes asked sharply. "Only that door and the two windows behind the drapes. Both were latched from within." Holmes went to the windows and examined the latches with a small glass. Then, without a word, he tugged aside the heavy curtain. "Ah," he murmured. "Watson, come and look here." I stepped beside him and saw it at once. The frost on the outside sill was unbroken, but a single faint scuff, a mark no longer than a thumb's length, marred the inside ledge. "Someone stood here," Holmes said, "and not long enough ago for the frost to recover." He turned. "But they did not enter this way. There is no evidence of it being opened recently. Nor could they have escaped through here, not without leaving trace." He crossed back to the centre of the room. "Tell me about the knife." Armitage hesitated. A narrow stiletto blade, surgical in precision, pierced the heart between the ribs. It was left in the wound. Watson cleared his throat. "You mentioned suicide was the first theory, and yet Witherton was left-handed." "Precisely," the colonel said. "And the wound came from the right, angled upward. Lestrade, of course, thinks he may have used a mirror to guide the motion, but Judith swears he was not a morbid or melancholic man, and I tend to agree." Holmes knelt by the fire and studied the grate. "This fire was recently tended," he murmured. "Ashes still warm. Something burned here after the murder?" He reached in with the tip of his cane and prodded the heap, revealing blackened paper and what looked like the charred remains of a ribbon or bookmark. He gently lifted a corner of the scorched paper and examined it with a look of keen interest. "Can you summon Miss Broom?" Holmes asked. "I should like to speak to her alone, if possible." Within minutes, a pale young woman entered, her hands nervously twisting a handkerchief. She had the look of someone holding tightly to the edges of her own sanity. "Miss Broom," Holmes said with surprising gentleness, "I am not the police, and I'm not here to cause you distress, but I must ask what you saw." I was coming to collect the tray," she began, her voice trembling. "As I opened the door, I glanced at the mirror over the fireplace. I saw Mr. Witherton sitting in the chair, his back to me, and behind him a man, a tall man in dark clothing. He had his arm raised, as if about to strike. I screamed and rushed in, but Mr. Witherton was already gone. The man was gone too." Holmes leaned forward. "You are sure you saw this in the mirror? Not in the room?" "Yes, sir. I only saw it in the mirror. In the room, there was no one." "Could you describe the man's face?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, his back was turned. Only his silhouette, and he wore a hat, I think, a wide-brimmed one, very old-fashioned." Holmes tapped his chin thoughtfully. "And no one else was in the hall? You saw no one leaving?" "No, sir. The corridor was empty." Holmes stood. "Thank you, Miss Broom. You may go." As she left, Holmes turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Well, Watson, what do you make of that?" "It's puzzling. A reflection of a man who wasn't in the room, and yet the mirror cannot lie." "Ah, but that's where you err. Mirrors tell the truth, but they tell it backward. That is their only deception." I stared at the mirror, then back at him. "You believe she saw something real then?" "I believe she saw what she believed to be real, which is not the same thing, but it is a start." He strode back to the mirror and stood in front of it, mimicking a seated posture. "If I sit here," he said, "and someone were to stand behind me, directly behind, the mirror would show them, but would reverse left and right. Tell me, Watson, how might that detail matter?" I blinked, then felt a thrill of realization. If the killer stood to his right, in the mirror it would appear he was on the left. Exactly. Now imagine someone who knew this. Someone who wished to mislead the observer, or perhaps knew the mirror would be the only witness. There was a sharp knock on the door. The butler entered with measured calm. "Miss Judith Witherton will see you now, Mr. Holmes, if you would follow me." Holmes nodded, his gaze lingering once more on the fireplace and the fragments in the grate. "Very good. Let us meet the sister," he said, buttoning his coat. "And see, Watson, if she can help us find the man who kills by reflection." And with that, we stepped from the drawing-room, leaving behind the shattered calm, the polished mirror, and a murder that had no place in the real world, only in its warped reflection. The room to which we were now shown was smaller and more intimate, though no less stately. Its walls lined with soft green silk and adorned with watercolours, its furnishings the delicate work of an earlier century. At the far side stood a young woman dressed in mourning black, though she wore her grief with composed dignity. Her hands were folded tightly before her, and her pale blue eyes met Holmes's gaze with quiet scrutiny, rather than helpless despair. "Miss Judith Witherton," the Colonel said. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson." She inclined her head. "Thank you for coming. I have heard your names spoken with respect even in courtly circles. If you are here, I presume we are not to be dismissed with a ruling of suicide." Holmes gave a slight bow, That would be an inelegant and, I think, incorrect conclusion, Miss Witherton. She gave a dry smile. That is precisely my thought. Holmes gestured gently. May we sit? She nodded, and we took the armchairs set near a low table. A tea service stood untouched, the lemon wedges already browning. I understand you last saw your brother at dinner, Holmes prompted. Yes, we dined together around 7:30. Miles was in his usual spirits, animated even. He had been at the Royal Academy earlier that day, meeting with one of his tutors about submitting a series of watercolours. He was very proud of his latest work. He was an artist? Indeed, not professionally, though he had recently begun to consider it. Watercolours, landscapes mostly, though he had taken an interest in portraiture over the past year. Did he show you anything recently? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes, just yesterday morning. He had been experimenting with reflected images, portraits seen in mirrors, sometimes distorted. He said he wanted to explore the difference between the subject and the reflection. Truth through distortion, he called it. Holmes's fingers steepled in sudden interest. And where are these works? Some are in his studio upstairs. Others he kept in his desk in the drawing room. Holmes stood. May I see the studio? Of course, I'll take you myself. We ascended the stairs to the upper floor, where Judith led us to a narrow room with tall windows and a faint scent of linseed oil. The walls were crowded with framed and unframed watercolours, rolling meadows, woodland streams, and, as Judith had said, several curious pieces of mirrored portraits. In one, a man's face was reflected twice in opposing mirrors, the features subtly warped, an odd, unsettling composition. Holmes stepped to the work table and began leafing carefully through the sketchbooks. He paused at one page and beckoned me forward. Observe, Watson, this sketch, note the perspective. Our artist has drawn a seated figure, seen only through a mirror's edge, but here, do you see? The reflection shows a hand reaching forward from behind. I studied the sketch. It was crude, a study rather than a finished piece, but unmistakable, a seated man unaware. And behind him, not rendered in full, a dark outline of another, a silhouette with arm raised. The mirror in the drawing room, I said. Could he have been rehearsing that very scene? Holmes turned to Judith. Did your brother speak of this subject in any particular way? Did he mention fears, obsessions? She folded her arms tightly. Not fears. He was always intense when focused on a theme, but never morbid. However, there is something... She crossed to a writing desk and opened a drawer. From within, she withdrew a folded letter and passed it to Holmes. He received this 2 days ago. I did not read it at first. I believed it to be private. But after what happened... Holmes opened the envelope with care. The note inside was unsigned and written in jagged, hurried strokes. You see them, don't you? In the mirror. As I do, you cannot draw the truth without inviting it. Stop now, before it steps through. Holmes read it twice. Do you know who sent this? Judith shook her head. Miles never mentioned it. Was anyone particularly close to him of late? A friend, a model, a tutor? There was one man, she said slowly. Mr. Julian Layton. He and Miles studied together at the academy. I met him once, quiet, intense. A little strange, I thought. Would he have any reason to resent your brother? I couldn't say. But Miles once said Julian had a fondness for the obscure and morbid. He painted graveyards and shadows. They argued once about a competition submission, I think. Where does Mr. Layton reside? I don't know, but the academy might. Holmes pocketed the letter. Thank you, Miss Witherton. You have been extraordinarily helpful. As we descended the staircase, I asked, "Well, what do you make of it, Holmes? The sketch? The letter?" "I think we are seeing only the outer surface of something quite calculated," he said. "There is intention behind this crime, Watson. Artistic, even philosophical in its design. This was not a quarrel or crime of passion. And the letter, did you see them in the mirror? Well, what does that mean?" "More importantly," Holmes said, "what does it mean that Witherton did not ignore it? He drew it over and over. He was compelled." We re-entered the drawing-room. Holmes strode to the desk and examined its drawers. In one, he found a leather-bound sketchbook. He flipped it open, studying page after page. "More mirror studies," he muttered. "And here, look, Watson." He held up a page that showed again a seated man. But this time the figure in the mirror was clearer, almost photographic in likeness. The silhouette behind was sharp now, bearing a distinct feature, a hat, wide-brimmed, tilted, the man from the maid's vision. "The girl was telling the truth," I said. "She saw what was in this sketch, what Witherton painted." "Or what Witherton expected her to see," Holmes corrected. "It is possible that our artist staged his own scene, knowing the mirror would be the only witness. But to what end?" At that moment, the door opened and Lestrade entered, his bowler hat still in hand and his overcoat dusted with fog's dampness. "Holmes! Thought I'd find you here." "You're late," Holmes said without turning. Lestrade looked affronted. "We've got a possible lead. A letter was found at Witherton's club, something about a disagreement with another student, a fellow named Leighton." "Already ahead of you," Holmes replied coolly. "We'll be visiting the Royal Academy next, but tell me, was the blade analyzed?" Lestrade frowned. "Small stiletto, military issue, post-Crimean era, common enough, no fingerprints, clean." Holmes nodded. "Then we are dealing with someone precise, someone with artistic hands and deliberate intent." "You mean Leighton?" "I mean someone who understands not just how to kill, but how to compose a murder." Lestrade gave an exasperated huff. "You always talk in riddles, Holmes." "No," Holmes said, eyes narrowing at the mirror once more. "It is our killer who speaks in riddles. I merely listen." He turned to me. "Watson, we must see the Academy. There's more to this reflection than a murderer hiding behind it. I think the mirror shows us what the killer wants us to believe and what Witherton feared to face." And with that, we left Harrington Court, the echo of the murder still shimmering behind us, as if caught forever in glass. The Royal Academy stood in solemn grandeur amid the drizzle of early afternoon, its classical facade streaked with soot and its stone lions glistening with damp. We arrived just as the gas lamps flickered to life in the hallways, their pale glow catching in the glass cases and bronze busts that lined the gallery vestibule. Holmes showed the desk clerk his card and made a brisk inquiry. Within minutes, we were led up a quiet stairwell and into a modest office that smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. There, behind a cluttered desk, strewn with schedules and charcoal-smudged portfolios, sat a sharp-nosed man with silvering hair and ink-stained cuffs. "Professor Harrow," Holmes began, "my name is Sherlock Holmes. I understand you were an instructor to Mr. Miles Witherton." Harrow looked up sharply, surprise cutting across his otherwise reserved demeanour. "Ah, yes. A tragedy. Miles was a gifted pupil, one of the few with both technical discipline and creative courage. You also know Julian Leighton?" "Yes, I taught them both. Same year." Leighton had promise, but something in his temperament held him back. He was easily unsettled, prone to obsession. He once destroyed half a year's work over a perceived flaw, in a background shadow, brilliant perhaps, but fragile. Did they get on well? Harrow gave a non-committal shrug. Well enough. But they diverged sharply in philosophy. Leighton painted fear, melancholy. Witherton sought truth, even when it was grotesque. I believe they disagreed on a recent series Miles submitted. I had to mediate. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Do you know Leighton's current whereabouts? Leighton rented a studio nearby, Charlotte Mews, I believe. Number 9, he left the academy earlier this year to pursue independent work. Would you say he was envious of Witherton? Harrow pursed his lips. He was, consumed by comparisons. He once accused Witherton of stealing a motif, mirror imagery, I think. Claimed it was his original idea. Absurd, of course, ideas are common. Execution is what matters. Holmes stood. Thank you, Professor. You've been most helpful. One last thing. Do you know what Witherton was working on before his death? A series titled Refractions. It was a departure from his landscapes, all figures, some drawn from life, some imagined. Reflections, reversals, symmetry. Strange work, but arresting. Back in the street, Holmes hailed a cab. To Charlotte Mews, he said, and quickly. As the cab rattled through the wet streets, Holmes sat forward in uncharacteristic agitation. Leighton is more than a rival, Watson. He is the key. The sketches, the reflections, the letter, all point to a man obsessed not with murder, but with meaning. He believes he's creating a work of art. A murder as art. Exactly. Staged with a mirror, shaped by the subject's own hand, interpreted through deception. This is a performance with only one audience in mind, whoever can see through it. Charlotte Mews proved to be a narrow alley of studio flats, most dark at this hour. Number 9 had a green door with peeling paint and a single window above, half covered with a torn shade. Holmes knocked sharply. No answer. He tried the latch. It opened with a creak. Careful, Holmes, I said, instinctively reaching for the pistol in my coat. This man may be dangerous. Indeed, Holmes said, stepping lightly into the gloom. Or he may already be gone. The studio was a wreck of shadows and strange imagery. Canvases leaned against every wall, some complete, others ghost-like in charcoal outline. The largest stood in the centre, turned toward the window. Holmes strode over and lit the oil lamp on the workbench. The glow revealed a massive painting, a mirror within a mirror, endless reflections spiralling into shadow. At the centre sat a figure unmistakably meant to be Miles Witherton, pale, stiff, and seated. Behind him, looming, was a cloaked figure with a wide-brimmed hat, arm raised. The very moment of death. We stared in silence. Good God, I murmured. He painted the murder in exact detail. Not quite exact, Holmes said softly. Look, Witherton faces away from the mirror, and the cloaked figure is us. What? Notice the angle of the shadows, the scale. We are not looking at a memory, we are looking at a recreation from the viewer's perspective. This was painted after the murder. But then, it means Leighton witnessed it, or believes he caused it, or staged it. Holmes examined the floor. A trail of footprints, half muddied, led to the canvas and back. A broken brush lay beneath the work table. Nearby, a set of sketches showed variations on the same theme. Witherton seated, a second figure behind, one sketch even bearing the phrase, "The mirror tells the truth only to those who already see it." Holmes picked up a sheet from the desk. It was a list. 6 names, Witherton's among them. 4 were crossed out. "Watson, look at this." The names read: C. Dunslow, crossed out M. Witherton, crossed out E. Harrington, crossed out P. Rooks, crossed out J. Witherton, blank. "What do you suppose this is?" I asked. "A list of subjects," Holmes replied, eyes narrowing. "Or victims. Judith is next." Suddenly there was a creak above, a floorboard groaning under weight. Holmes grabbed my arm, pulled me back into the shadow of the shelves just as footsteps descended the narrow stair. A moment later, a man emerged into the light. He was tall, thin, wild-eyed. His hair hung in greasy waves, and his hands were stained with pigment and ash. He froze when he saw the open door, then turned. Too late. Holmes was on him in an instant, pinning his arm behind his back. "Julian Layton, I presume?" Holmes said. The man struggled, his eyes darting to the canvas. "You have no right." "We have reason," Holmes snapped. "Miles Witherton is dead. You painted his murder. Explain yourself." Layton went still. His voice, when it came, was ragged. "I didn't kill him. I saw it. In the mirror, I told him he was drawing too close. Something behind the reflection. Something hungry." I exchanged a look with Holmes. The man was unraveling. "I warned him," Layton continued. "But he laughed, said art was meant to disturb. Then he started drawing it over and over, reflections that didn't match the room, shadows that moved differently. It was like the mirror remembered things that hadn't happened yet." Holmes let go of him slowly. "So you came to his house?" "Yes, I wanted to stop him. I waited until his sister went upstairs. I knocked, but he wouldn't answer. So I looked in the window, and I saw it. Not him, it. The figure in the mirror, the one I'd been painting." "You're saying you witnessed his death from outside?" "Yes. And then I painted it, so people would believe me, so they'd see." Holmes turned away, eyes flashing. "Watson, this is no murderer. Not by our measure." "But the list?" I asked. Layton's face twitched. "They were all people I'd seen in reflections, people who vanished. They thought I was mad, but I only painted what was already there." Holmes stepped close to the canvas once more, examining the brushstrokes with a cold, analytical eye. "He believes it," Holmes said. "That is clear." "And you?" I asked. "I believe we are still missing a layer," he replied. "We have the reflection, but not yet the source." Turning back to Layton, Holmes said, "Julian, where were you the night Miles died?" "At my studio." "Alone, painting. Ask the neighbour. She saw the light all night." Holmes nodded. "Very well. Then we return to Harrington Court. There's one image we haven't examined closely enough." "What's that?" I asked. "The mirror?" Holmes replied. "If Witherton was killed in the reflection, then perhaps the reflection left a clue behind. And so we departed the studio, with a mad painter in custody, a painting too exact for coincidence, and a question that had twisted itself around our necks like fog. If the mirror witnessed the murder, did it also witness the murderer? We returned to Harrington Court as the fog thickened over London like a closing hand, choking the light from the street lamps and turning the houses into mute sentinels of secrets unspoken. The butler let us in with a grave nod, having been forewarned by telegram of our arrival. Holmes moved with purpose, neither speaking nor pausing, as he strode up the stairs and into the drawing-room where the murder had occurred. The room was unchanged. The fire had long since gone out, and the lingering scent of soot and perfume had faded into the wallpaper. Holmes crossed at once to the great mirror above the mantel. He stood directly in front of it, arms behind his back, his keen eyes scanning the frame, the surface, the shadows. I watched him with growing curiosity, unsure what he hoped to discover from a pane of polished glass. Then, with a suddenness that startled me, he drew a glove from his coat and ran his fingers carefully along the inner edge of the gilt frame, pausing at the upper right corner. He produced a penknife from his pocket, flicked it open, and, very delicately, inserted the blade between the frame and the mirror's backing. A faint click sounded. Holmes smiled grimly. "Watson," he said, "help me lift this." We eased the mirror from the wall. It was heavier than it appeared, and as we set it on the nearby settee, a folded slip of paper, yellowed and thin as onion skin, fell from the hollow compartment behind the frame. Holmes snatched it up and unfolded it. On it was a rough sketch, charcoal and ink, clearly drawn by Miles Witherton. It showed the drawing room precisely rendered. In the mirror, his own reflection sat calmly in the chair. But the figure behind him, this time, was not wearing the wide-brimmed hat. It was a man in a double-breasted suit, neat, elegant, and unmistakably familiar. Holmes held it out to me. "Do you recognize him?" I stared. "Good heavens, Colonel Armitage." "Indeed. But why would Witherton hide a sketch of Armitage behind the mirror? That, Watson, is the question we must now pursue." Holmes turned back to the wall and ran his gloved fingers over the wallpaper surrounding the mirror's place. He stopped at a tiny crack near the upper moulding, tapped it, and then looked back at me. "Help me with the chair." Together we dragged the velvet armchair slightly to the right. Holmes fetched a short stool and climbed upon it, inspecting the wall with a small glass. Then he produced a length of twine from his pocket, tied it to a nail he hammered gently into the centre of the wooden beam, and let it dangle straight down. The line passed precisely through the chair's back, directly where Witherton had sat. He stepped down, satisfied. The mirror showed everything, from precisely the angle a viewer in the hall would have seen, including, crucially, the position of the supposed killer. But if Armitage was reflected behind Witherton, how could that be? He claimed not to be in the house. My thoughts were racing. "Are you suggesting Colonel Armitage was present here at the time of the murder?" "I'm suggesting," Holmes said, eyes gleaming, "that the mirror never lies, Watson, but people do." A sharp knock came at the door, and Lestrade entered with his typical look of weary irritation. "I've been up to my elbows in painters and ghost stories," he said. "I trust you found something more substantial." Holmes handed him the hidden sketch. "Does this man look familiar?" Lestrade studied it. "That's the Colonel, isn't it? He told us he arrived after the murder, but this image was hidden by Witherton behind the mirror, a man he apparently feared, or at least watched closely. Why hide a sketch unless he suspected Armitage of something?" Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "You think Armitage killed him?" "I think," Holmes said, "he had both motive and opportunity, and perhaps something more, a deception constructed with a level of precision that only someone familiar with the house's layout could manage." "But the maid saw a man in a hat." "Yes," Holmes cut in. "A figure made to be seen, deliberately misrepresented. A hat, a cloak, costume, meant to suggest a phantom, a faceless attacker." "Why?" I asked. "Because Armitage needed a murder that would appear inexplicable, supernatural even, one that would lead investigators away from rational suspects." Lestrade looked troubled. "But why kill Witherton at all?" Holmes drew from his pocket the letter Leighton had received, the warning to Witherton, urging him to stop painting reflections. Because Witherton had discovered something he wasn't meant to. In his pursuit of artistic truth, he drew what he saw, not what he imagined. And what he saw, I suspect, was Colonel Armitage committing some act, or planning one, worth killing over. "Such as?" I asked. Holmes steepled his fingers. "That remains the final layer of the puzzle." Lestrade crossed to the fireplace. "You mentioned burned paper. Could it have been a letter? Evidence?" "I believe so," Holmes said, "and I believe it was destroyed after the murder. Someone returned to the room, perhaps moments later, to eliminate whatever Witherton had placed in the fire. The ashes were still warm when we first arrived." "Then Armitage could have come back?" Lestrade muttered. Holmes smiled. "Precisely." Just then the butler entered quietly. "Begging your pardon, sir, but Colonel Armitage has returned. He's in the downstairs study." Holmes nodded to Lestrade. "Shall we, Inspector?" We descended together. The study was a dark, panelled room with bookshelves lined with military histories and travel memoirs. Armitage stood at the desk, thumbing through a leather-bound volume. He looked up at us without surprise. "Back so soon, gentlemen?" he said coolly. "I trust your inquiries are progressing." Holmes stepped forward. "We've just returned from your late godson's studio." "I beg your pardon?" "Miles Witherton. You sponsored his education, did you not, as his late father's friend?" Armitage inclined his head. "That is correct." "And did you also discourage his recent artistic shift, away from landscapes and toward reflections?" Armitage raised an eyebrow. "I may have questioned the themes. They were growing unsettling." Holmes took a slow step forward. "You were here the night he died, inside the house. You wore a wide-brimmed hat and dark cloak. The maid saw your reflection, but it wasn't an accident. It was intentional. You disguised yourself to appear like something from one of Witherton's sketches." Armitage stiffened. "This is absurd." "You murdered him," Holmes said coldly. "Because he painted something he wasn't supposed to. Perhaps he sketched you with someone, a meeting, a transaction, something incriminating. He hid the sketch in the mirror frame, but it wasn't the only copy, was it?" Lestrade stepped forward. "We'll need to search your home, Colonel." Armitage's calm broke. "You have no warrant?" "We'll obtain one," Lestrade said, "unless you prefer to cooperate now." Armitage stared at Holmes, the icy sheen of arrogance slipping into panic. "I warned him," he muttered. "I told him to burn those sketches. He didn't listen." "He listened," Holmes said. "He just didn't obey." There was a silence. Then Armitage sank into the armchair behind the desk, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean to kill him. I only meant to frighten him, to make him stop." Holmes said nothing. "He confronted me," Armitage went on, "accused me of spying on Judith, implied things. I told him he was imagining it. Then he showed me the sketch. I tried to take it. He refused. It escalated." Lestrade turned slowly. "That's a confession." Armitage nodded mutely. As Lestrade began reading him his rights, Holmes turned and walked out into the corridor. I followed. "Well," I said, stunned. "You were right. The mirror showed the truth, just not the one we expected." Holmes stopped beside the staircase, his face grave. "No, Watson, it showed the truth Witherton feared, and that truth cost him his life. But he left a message for us, in pigment and shadow." He looked back once toward the drawing-room, and then turned toward the door. "Come," he said, "we are finished with reflections, for now." The following morning, Baker Street had resumed its usual rhythm, the thud of delivery carts on the cobbles, the whistle of the milkman, the occasional bark from a terrier passing in a hansom cab. But inside 221B, the air was thick with thought. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, eyes closed, fingers pressed together in the steepled attitude that signalled the engine of his mind was working at full speed. I had just set down the morning edition of the Times, its front page already splashed with cautious mentions of the Harrington Court reflection murder, when Holmes stirred at last and reached for his pipe. "Armitage will hang," he said flatly, not as opinion, but as if observing the weather. "Yes," I replied. "Lestrade said he gave a full confession, manslaughter in a fit of panic, though I doubt the Crown will accept that phrasing once the sketch is admitted into evidence." Holmes exhaled a thin line of smoke. "But the case, Watson, is not finished." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "The motive is clear. He feared exposure. The sketch Witherton made of him, possibly with Miss Judith or in some compromising situation, was enough to spark violence. His staged mirror deception, The disguise, the cloak and hat, all explained. We even know he returned to the scene to destroy evidence. Indeed, and yet Holmes stood abruptly and began pacing. There are still questions unanswered. Why did Witherton make multiple mirror sketches, some depicting someone other than Armitage? Why was Leighton, however, disturbed, convinced he was witnessing something real in the mirror? You think there's more to this than a jealous godfather and an artist with a guilty conscience? I know there is. He crossed into his desk, where he had placed the last recovered sketch from Witherton's studio. It depicted a sequence, 3 versions of the same room reflected through the same mirror. In the first, Witherton sat alone. In the second, a faint figure emerged behind him. In the third, the figure loomed, now with features obscured, and Witherton's reflection was slumped to one side. Holmes turned it toward me. "Study this, Watson. Tell me what you see." I frowned. "A visual progression, the approach of the killer." "No," Holmes interrupted. "Not the killer. Look again. In the first sketch, Witherton's mirror image sits upright. In the second, his reflection is looking away. In the third, he appears lifeless. But the room in the mirror changes too, subtly. Note the angle of the chandelier, the shadow from the drapes. It shifts between each drawing." I leaned in. "You're right, but what does that mean?" "It means these are not studies of one moment, but of different moments from different perspectives. Leighton said Witherton believed the mirror remembered things yet to happen, that it could reflect more than just the room." "You're drifting into superstition." Holmes shook his head. "Not superstition, obsession, psychological projection, but still rooted in logic. What if Witherton suspected someone was watching him, using the mirror? What if he left a clue inside it?" At this, I blinked. Inside the mirror? Holmes walked to the window where a shaft of morning light filtered through. He gestured to the faint reflection on the pane. We think of mirrors as surfaces, but they're also layers, glass, silvering, sometimes backing boards. Witherton was meticulous. He hid one drawing in the frame. What if he hid another elsewhere? Within the hour, we were back at Harrington Court, much to Lestrade's exasperation. "I don't know why you keep worrying this case like a terrier," he grumbled, allowing Holmes back into the drawing room. He confessed, "Holmes, we've got motive, means, opportunity, and a witness who saw his reflection. What else is there?" "A final layer," Holmes said. "I need the mirror removed entirely from the frame." Lestrade frowned. "You think it's been tampered with?" "I think it may be the only surviving witness," Holmes replied. 2 constables helped remove the mirror from its heavy, gilded frame and placed it flat on a padded cloth across the drawing-room table. Holmes examined the glass with a jeweller's loupe, inspecting its edge with delicate care. Then, using a scalpel from my medical bag, he scraped away a small section of the wooden backing. There, a faint bulge in the silvering. Holmes slid a thin palette knife beneath it and pried gently. A tiny square of card peeled loose from the glass, thin as a moth's wing and no larger than a playing card. It bore only one word, written in Witherton's distinct, neat hand, "Rook." Holmes exhaled. As I feared, Lestrade blinked. What is that? A name?" "Philip Rooks," I said, remembering. "He was on Leighton's list, one of the names crossed out." Holmes nodded. "And now we know why." He turned to Lestrade. "We need to find out how Philip Rooks died, and when, because I believe he, too, met his end under circumstances similar to Witherton's." Lestrade looked sceptical, but motioned to one of his men. "Get the records office. Ask for any deaths involving that name in the past year. Quiet ones, overlooked ones." The constable left. Holmes turned to the fireplace and stared into the cold grate. Witherton was not afraid of Armitage, he said softly. He was afraid of a pattern, something he couldn't explain but saw repeating. Rooks, Carrington, Dunsloe, all crossed off, all possibly dead. I stepped forward, chills creeping down my spine. You're saying someone has been killing them in order, and Leighton saw it in the mirror? Perhaps not. The killer, Holmes murmured. But the idea of one, a man shaped by guilt, delusion, or design. Someone who manipulates from behind the frame. There was a sharp rap at the door. The constable returned, slightly breathless. Sir, there was a Philip Rooks, died 6 months ago, declared accidental fall from a stairwell in Bloomsbury. No witnesses. Lestrade frowned. No witnesses again. Holmes turned to me. You begin to see it, Watson? These are not isolated acts, they are rehearsals. For what? I asked. Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he crossed to the now empty frame where the mirror had hung and tapped gently along the inner wood. Judith Witherton, he said slowly. She's the only name not crossed off, the last. Lestrade's face paled. Do you think she's in danger? I think she was always the final act in someone's theatre of reflections. The question is, whose? That evening, we sent word to Miss Witherton, asking her to meet us at Baker Street under the pretext of discussing her brother's artistic estate. She arrived just before 7, pale, composed, dressed in a modest grey coat with a black ribbon still pinned at her collar. I hope this isn't official business, she said gently, accepting a cup of tea I offered. I've had little appetite for it lately. Holmes sat across from her, his expression unreadable. Miss Witherton, he said, I must ask you something difficult. Did your brother ever confide in you about Philip Rooks, or any of the names in this list? He handed her a copy of the list found in Leighton's studio. She scanned it and blinked. Yes, Rooks came to the house once. I didn't meet him. Miles said he was an old school acquaintance. I remember because I teased him that he kept such strange friends. Did he mention anything about a pattern? A fear he couldn't explain? She hesitated. He said he felt as though someone was watching the people he painted, that they were being erased, one by one. I told him to stop painting portraits for a while. And did he? No, he couldn't. He said the only way to see clearly was through the mirror, that it showed people as they truly were, if only for a moment. Holmes nodded. Then it's as I feared. He turned to me. We've missed something, Watson, something central. Armitage may have struck the blow, but the murder was merely the consequence of a longer orchestration. You think Armitage was used? I think Armitage was exploited, his pride, his fear of exposure. Just as Witherton was manipulated into his obsessions, and just as Leighton was driven mad by what he thought he saw. Miss Witherton spoke quietly. But who would do such a thing? Holmes' eyes flicked to the window where the first gaslight shimmered in the glass. That, he said, is what we must now find out, because the real killer has yet to show his reflection. And in that quiet room, as the shadows deepened and the air turned still, I felt something shift, not in the room itself, but in the very angle of the world we had been observing, as though we too had been looking only into a mirror and were now about to step through. That night, long after Miss Witherton had departed and the lamps in Baker Street flickered like weary sentries against the thickening fog, Holmes remained at his desk poring over the sketches we had recovered. Witherton's haunted images, Leighton's unfinished paintings, the cryptic list with its crossed-out names. He hadn't spoken in nearly an hour, save for an occasional grunt, as he made a note, or repositioned a drawing, beneath his magnifying glass. I, meanwhile, sat by the fire, trying in vain to find logic where Holmes clearly saw connections. I had grown accustomed to his silences over the years, but tonight they felt different, deeper, more turbulent, as if he were pacing a ledge in his mind, peering down into something that refused to yield its shape. Eventually, I could no longer contain myself. "Holmes," I said, "this theory, this idea of someone behind all this, it's more than a killer. You're describing a designer, a conductor. But what sort of man orchestrates murders not for gain or revenge, but for structure, for theme?" Holmes didn't look up. "The same sort of man who understands that truth is easier to bury beneath belief than beneath evidence. These deaths, Witherton, Rooks, Harrington, they were not random, they were acts in a performance, reflections built one atop the other." "And the audience?" Holmes finally turned toward me, his eyes sharp. "Us, Watson, the world. Or perhaps more specifically, me." I started. "You." He stood, crossing the room to the cabinet where he kept his personal files, scrapbooks, letters, clippings, the strange and forgotten detritus of 100 cases. He withdrew a thin envelope and opened it, revealing a letter yellowed by time. "Do you remember," he said slowly, "a man named Sebastian Moran?" "Of course. Moriarty's lieutenant. A killer, precise and cruel. You captured him after Reichenbach." Holmes nodded. Before his trial, Moran corresponded with another man, an admirer, a playwright of sorts, an individual obsessed with structure who saw crime not as an act of passion, but of narrative. His name was Vincent Drelincourt, an academic, a minor philosopher. He wrote a tract on criminal semiotics, suggesting that the perfect crime was not one that evaded justice, but one that altered meaning. I frowned. "I don't recall his name." "Few do. He vanished shortly after Moran's sentencing. I dismissed it at the time. An eccentric, nothing more. But yesterday, as we examined Witherton's list, I recalled something. Drelincourt once wrote that the mirror is the purest stage because it holds no audience and no actor, only perception." I blinked. "You think Drelincourt is behind these murders?" "I think he never vanished. I think he stepped behind the frame and has been watching ever since." A heavy knock interrupted us. Lestrade entered, looking winded and pale. "There's been another." We stared at him. "Another murder," he said. "Happened within the last hour. Name's Edith Harrington." Holmes's face darkened. "Harrington," he repeated. "Another from the list." Lestrade nodded grimly. "Found in her home in Belgravia, alone, doors locked, no sign of forced entry, knife wound, clean and deliberate, and—" He hesitated. "A mirror in the room, smashed." Within the hour we were on the scene, the fog parting before the lanterns of Lestrade's carriage like the folds of a theatre curtain. The Carrington townhouse was elegant, tucked away on a quiet street. The interior bore signs of tasteful wealth, Persian rugs, gilt-framed portraits, a pianoforte in the parlour, but everything now seemed muted by the presence of death. We were shown to the upper drawing-room where Miss Carrington had been found. Her body had already been removed, but the room remained undisturbed otherwise. A wide cheval mirror had been knocked over and lay in shards on the floor. Holmes crouched beside the debris, examining each splinter. "Note the blood, Watson," he said softly. "It's only on the floor, not on the mirror." I nodded. "She didn't knock it over during a struggle." "Precisely. The killer shattered it after the act. Deliberately. Why?" Lestrade hovered in the doorway. "Maybe she saw him coming." "No," Holmes interrupted. "He wanted her to see. It's part of the ritual." He turned and surveyed the room. The furniture had been slightly rearranged. The chair at the vanity had been pulled back, too far to be comfortable. And on the carpet nearby, faint impressions showed where someone had stood for quite some time. Stage directions, Holmes murmured. He positioned her, made sure the reflection was just right. Then, action. He stood and turned to Lestrade. This isn't over. There's one name left. Lestrade paled. Judith. Yes, we must get to her. But even as we rushed back to Baker Street to send word, we were intercepted. A boy from the telegraph office was waiting outside 221B. Holmes opened the message and read it aloud. Miss Judith Witherton left residence at 10:17 p.m. in private cab. Notified by visitor bearing your card. Said matter urgent. Destination unknown. Holmes's eyes went ice cold. My card, he repeated. He's taken her. Who? Lestrade barked. Drelincourt. He's drawing the curtain on his final act. We stared at one another in the street, the city still around us like the breath held before an opera's climax. Where would he take her? I asked. Holmes turned slowly toward the darkened skyline. A mirror has no home, Watson, but an artist does. A stage, and I believe I know, where he built his final scene. He turned to Lestrade. Do you still have the address from Julian Layton's old mentor, the first place he painted Reflections? Lestrade blinked. The abandoned studio in Whitechapel? Yes, there. Why there? Because Layton, for all his madness, didn't invent the idea of mirrored murder. He learned it. The studio isn't Layton's. It belonged to Drelincourt before he disappeared. Layton inherited the space and the idea. I saw the answer land in Lestrade's mind. Then Drelincourt has returned to his stage. Holmes nodded once. And if we don't reach her in time, Judith Witherton will become the final reflection. We boarded Lestrade's carriage again, the horses lashing through the mist at breakneck pace. None of us spoke. Even Holmes was still. I could hear the wheels of logic turning in his mind, assembling the details into some final understanding. As we neared Whitechapel, the fog thickened into something almost sentient, curling around the cobblestones like a watchful presence. The carriage stopped before a row of disused buildings, their windows black, their signs faded. Number 17, Holmes said. We approached on foot, our shoes echoing on the wet stones. The door was ajar. Holmes raised a hand to stop us, then stepped through into the darkness. Inside, the studio smelled of damp wood, oil and something else, an acrid tang that reminded me of burnt varnish. Gaslight flickered at the far end of the room, illuminating a chair, a mirror, and before it, Judith Witherton. She was seated, bound delicately at the wrists with silk ribbon, her expression calm but watchful. She turned her eyes to us, unafraid. Behind her stood a man in a dark coat, his face gaunt and sharp, eyes gleaming with eerie intensity. Vincent Drelincourt, Holmes said. The man smiled. Welcome, Mr. Holmes. You're just in time for the final tableau. And with that, the mirror flickered, no longer reflecting reality, but something else, something that had been staged for us. The scene before us was like something from a fever dream, poised with terrible elegance. Judith Witherton sat unmoving in the straight-backed chair, her eyes trained on Holmes with a calm that belied the danger of her position. Her wrists were bound in a way that suggested restraint more symbolic than necessary. There was no force in it, only ritual. Vincent Drelincourt, gaunt as a penstroke and draped in a dark, threadbare frock coat, stood behind her as if introducing an actress to the stage. The light from a single gas lamp played over his features, casting deep shadows that hollowed his cheeks and threw his prominent nose into sharp relief. But it was his eyes that struck me most. They were not the eyes of a madman, but of a man who wanted to be seen as mad, who wore the costume of madness to terrify and distract. Holmes advanced a single pace into the room. Let her go. Drelincourt tilted his head, smiling. She's not in danger, not yet, you know that. You've already seen the pattern. You've understood its purpose. I understand that you've murdered at least 4 people, Holmes said coldly. That you used mirrors, not just as stage props, but as your medium. You believe you're creating a work of art. Drelincourt gave a slight bow. At last, an audience worthy of the composition. Lestrade, standing beside me, shifted his weight forward, but Holmes raised a hand to stop him. "If we charge in, she dies," Holmes murmured. Drelincourt moved behind the mirror. It was immense, larger than the one at Harrington Court, and mounted on a wheeled frame like a piece of set dressing. But it was angled oddly, tilted slightly forward, reflecting not just the room, but also the ceiling above and the flicker of gaslight. "This mirror," Drelincourt said softly, "was once used by a ballet company. Dancers would rehearse entire performances in its reflection, and yet the reflection changed them. They danced more fiercely for the mirror than for the stage, because they could see themselves," Holmes said. "No." Drelincourt's smile was strange. "Because they saw someone else, some version of themselves that moved without hesitation. The reflection is not a copy, it is a suggestion, a prophecy. The mirror does not show you what is there, Mr. Holmes. It shows you what will be, if you do not intervene." Judith stirred slightly, her gaze flicking to the mirror. I followed it and caught my breath. In the reflection she was alone. No chair, no bindings, no Drelincourt. Only her. And she was standing, looking straight at me. Holmes saw it too. His brows drew together in a flash of comprehension. "You reversed it," he said. "Not just in the image, but in the concept." Drelincourt's smile widened. "A mirror is not a picture. It is a doorway, one you enter with your mind, not your body. You, of all men, should understand that." Lestrade stepped forward. "Enough of this nonsense. You'll come with us." Drelincourt made no move. "If you take me now, you'll never understand. She will go free. I've arranged for that. But the performance, the final act, will remain incomplete." "Then consider it cancelled," Holmes said sharply. "You failed. You revealed yourself, and your audience sees you clearly." Judith spoke at last, her voice steady. "Holmes!" He turned sharply. "I saw something," she said. "In the mirror. It's not me. It's him, behind me. But it's not real, is it?" Holmes's voice gentled. "It's a construction, Miss Witherton, a projection meant to frighten you. Drelincourt has spent years building illusions so precise they appear prophetic." "And yet," Drelincourt said, they come true." "You make them come true," Holmes snapped. "You kill to fulfill the vision. You guide others, Armitage, Leighton, into madness so that your narrative plays out like a Greek tragedy. You pretend to observe fate when you are its author." He stepped forward. "You used Witherton's talent. You planted ideas in Leighton's mind. You watched as your chosen reflections, Rooks, Carrington, acted out your scenes. You even allowed Armitage to become the visible hand of violence, knowing that he would confess, that he would collapse under the weight of guilt." "And yet you still came," Drelincourt said. "You couldn't resist. The final image, the woman, the chair, the mirror, was always meant for you." Holmes moved again, subtle as a fencer. "If this is a play, Drelincourt, then you've misjudged your audience. I'm not here to watch." With a sudden lunge, Holmes grabbed the side of the mirror's frame and swung it violently to one side. The mirror fell with a crash, glass exploding across the floor in a silver storm. Judith cried out, shrinking back, but remained unharmed. The illusion broke. The room, so carefully arranged, was revealed to be just that, a stage. No traps, no tricks, only a man, a bound woman, and a shattered reflection. Drelincourt stood frozen for a moment, staring at the broken glass as though something sacred had been defiled. Then he lunged, not at Holmes, but toward a black lacquered box near the wall. Lestrade moved quickly, intercepting him, and together we brought him down. He fought with surprising strength, snarling, clawing, but in seconds he was restrained, his arms wrenched behind him, wrists bound with his own ribbon. Holmes opened the lacquered box. Inside were letters, diagrams, sketches, scores of them, pages annotated in Drelincourt's cramped, spidery hand. "What is it?" I asked. "The script," Holmes said. "His entire plan, each death, each location, each act, all choreographed in advance." Judith stood now, her bonds having been cut by Lestrade. She came forward slowly, her face pale but resolved. "He told me," she said quietly, "that I was the last, that once the audience saw me in the mirror, the story would be complete." Holmes looked at her gravely. "No, you were never the ending. You were only the reflection he wanted the world to mistake for an ending." Drelincourt, panting on the floor, laughed bitterly. "You don't understand. You think I'm the villain. But I only illuminated what others were already prepared to do. I didn't make Armitage jealous. I didn't force Witherton to be afraid. I only showed them their true selves." Holmes knelt beside him. "And what are you, Drelincourt? The mirror? The viewer? Or the puppet master who cuts the strings when the scene goes too long?" Drelincourt didn't answer. Lestrade stood. "I'll take him in. There's more than enough to hang him, probably twice." "See that you do," Holmes said, "and keep those documents sealed. They are not philosophy, they are blueprints for madness." As Drelincourt was led out, Holmes turned back to Judith, who stood by the broken mirror, looking down into its fragments. "Is it over?" she asked. "Yes," Holmes said softly. "The reflection is gone, and what remains is real." She nodded once. "Thank you." We walked her out into the night. The fog had finally lifted, revealing stars above like scattered flecks of paint on velvet. Holmes stood quietly beside me on the street, watching the constables load Drelincourt into the wagon. "What will you do with his writings?" I asked. "Destroy them," Holmes said. "Drelincourt wanted to be remembered. That must be denied him." "And the mirror?" He turned to me with the faintest smile. "Shattered, like his illusions." We walked back to Baker Street in silence. And for once, the reflections in the windows we passed showed only what was truly there. No ghosts, no hidden figures, no shadows waiting behind. Only ourselves. Back at 221B Baker Street, dawn broke reluctantly over the rooftops of London, its pale light creeping through the gauzy curtains like a visitor unsure of its welcome. The fire had burned low in the grate, but neither Holmes nor I had moved to stoke it. The previous night's events lingered in the air, thick as tobacco smoke, and neither of us had spoken since returning. Holmes sat slouched in his chair, fingertips pressed beneath his chin, eyes trained not on any object in the room, but on the lingering image of Drelincourt's shattered mirror. I recognized this posture well. It was the stillness of deep, post-mortem reflection, of sorting threads into cause and consequence. But even I could sense there was something different about this aftermath. The case was closed, the murderer captured, the victim saved, and yet Holmes was uneasy. "I cannot decide," he said at last, "whether Drelincourt was a monster or merely the shadow cast by monsters." I turned from the window where I'd been watching the first milkman pass in his rattling cart. "He killed them, Holmes. He arranged the entire scheme. Isn't that monstrous enough?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "Oh, certainly, but what interests me more is how he did it, without lifting a hand in most cases. He turned mirrors into weapons, not by poisoning the glass, but by poisoning perspective. Witherton, Leighton, Armitage, they each acted within their own character. Drelincourt simply adjusted the lighting." He rose abruptly, crossed to his desk, and retrieved a small bundle of documents tied in twine, the notes, sketches, and letters recovered from the lacquered box. Though Lestrade had taken most of Drelincourt's archive into custody, Holmes had secured this bundle, arguing that certain elements were too dangerous or obscure for the general record. Unbinding the twine, he spread the papers across the table like tarot cards. I joined him, recognizing some of the documents, sketches of rooms arranged like theatres, notes on timing and angle, annotations scribbled in the margins of philosophical tracts. One sheet caught my eye, a list of what appeared to be Latin quotations, each one paired with a date. Holmes noticed my interest. Those are Drelincourt's working epigraphs, like scene headers in a play. He was meticulous about meaning. I translated one aloud, speculum non mentitur, sed mens fallit saepsum. The mirror does not lie, but the mind deceives itself. Holmes gave a quiet nod. His philosophy distilled. Another note, more recent, read, Ultimus actus, speculum fractum est. The final act, the mirror is broken. I drew a sharp breath. He planned it all along, even his own downfall. Yes, Holmes murmured. To him, being caught was not failure, it was completion. He turned and began pacing slowly, his steps soundless on the carpet. Think of it, Watson, a man who spent years crafting not just murders, but meaning. He used others as brushes, painted with their weaknesses. He believed his work would live beyond him, not as crime, but as philosophy. And what do we call it? I asked. A delusion? A performance? Holmes stopped, facing the fire. We call it dangerous, and we learn from it. He turned back to the desk and picked up one final sheet, smaller and folded once. He opened it and read aloud. He who sees himself clearly in the mirror has already begun to vanish. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he folded the note and placed it back in the fireproof safe he kept beneath the floorboards. That afternoon, Lestrade paid us a visit. He looked older than he had the week before, the lines around his mouth etched deeper. He declined tea, standing with his hands clasped behind his back like a man offering penance. Well, he said at last, it's done. Drelincourt has confessed to planning all of it, every name on the list. He denies committing the murders directly, but admits to orchestrating them. Calls it direction. Claims he never laid a finger on a soul, only their motives. He's not wrong, Holmes said, but the law will hold him accountable for every death. Lestrade nodded. He'll hang, I've no doubt. And frankly, I'll sleep better knowing he won't be out there writing a sequel. Holmes didn't smile. He's already written one, Lestrade. It's our task to make sure it's never staged. Lestrade hesitated at the door. You'll submit a report? I'll write a private account, Holmes said, but I suspect Watson's version will be the one people remember. I glanced up. And what version is that, Holmes? One that makes clear this was not a case about mirrors, he said, but about people. How easily they can be led to perform a tragedy if someone simply shows them the stage and says, act. After Lestrade left, the flat felt emptier than usual. I sat at my writing desk, staring at the blank page before me. Outside, the city was slowly returning to itself, markets reopening, the rattle of carriages resuming, the grey skies parting to allow a little light. Holmes returned to his chair, his violin resting across his knees. He didn't play. You know, Watson, he said quietly, I keep thinking about Miss Witherton's reflection, that final moment. She said she saw herself standing, not sitting, free, not bound. I nodded. Yes, I remember. What if, he continued, that was not Drelincourt's illusion but her own? What if she saw who she had to become in order to survive? A self-fulfilling prophecy, I suggested. perhaps, but one made not from fear, but from resolve. He drew the bow across the strings, releasing a single note. It hung in the air like breath in winter, fragile, pure, and vanishing. "We are all reflections of something, Watson," he said softly. "The question is, do we control the image, or does it control us?" I did not answer, not immediately. Instead, I wrote. I wrote the story of Miles Witherton, the artist who painted the unseen, of Julian Layton, who saw too much and went mad from it, of Armitage, who let fear become his mirror, and of Vincent Drelincourt, who tried to cast the world in shadow and failed because a single woman, bound but unbroken, refused to act the part he wrote for her. But mostly I wrote about Holmes, who shattered the mirror before the final curtain could fall. And as I closed my notebook, I caught a glimpse of our reflections in the window. He, seated, bowed over the violin. I, with pen poised above the page. Two figures, caught in a frame, and, for once, perfectly real. The days that followed passed quietly, too quietly, perhaps, for a man like Sherlock Holmes, whose mind required complexity as others require air. Yet there was no new case pressing on his time, no urgent telegram to rouse him from his chair, only the still echoes of the performance we had interrupted, and the knowledge that its orchestrator now sat behind iron bars, awaiting a trial he would never attend. Vincent Drelincourt had taken his own life. The news came by telegram from Lestrade, delivered in the early morning by a stone-faced boy who had no idea of the weight he carried in his satchel. I opened the message as Holmes stood at the window, watching Baker Street shake off its sleep. I read it aloud. Drelincourt found dead in cell, poison concealed in jacket lining, left no note, case officially closed. Lestrade. Holmes did not turn from the window. "I thought he might," he said softly. "You suspected he had poison?" "No, but I knew he wouldn't tolerate an ending he didn't write himself." I let the telegram fall to the table. "Then it's done." Holmes turned to me slowly, and there was something in his expression, neither satisfaction nor regret, but a kind of abstract melancholy. "No, Watson, it will never truly be done." I stared at him. "You think he has followers?" "Not in the literal sense, but his ideas, the belief that truth is malleable, that people are players in stories they do not author, those beliefs linger, they take root in the minds of the discontented, and in a world as complex as ours, there will always be someone eager to reshape it through design rather than law." He stepped away from the window and sat down opposite me. Drelincourt didn't merely kill people, he curated them. He arranged their fears and flaws like stage props, then stood behind the curtain and watched them destroy themselves. And the most dangerous part of it all was that he didn't act for personal gain, but for philosophical conviction. "But he's dead," I said. "His crimes ended with him." Holmes shook his head. "Only because we shattered the mirror before he could finish his final act. But others may yet take up his script." I said nothing for a time, watching the fire. Then I asked, "Do you truly believe that Judith Witherton would have died if we'd been even minutes later?" Holmes leaned forward. "Not in the way Harrington or Rooks died. Drelincourt wouldn't have used a knife. He would have convinced her to do it herself, or to allow it. That was his talent. He didn't need to kill. He only needed to persuade people that death was part of the story they had always been meant to tell." I felt a chill. He wanted her to see herself as a victim. "Yes," Holmes said. "And had she believed that image, had she accepted it as her role, she would have become one. But she didn't." He stood and walked to the mantel, gazing at the framed photograph of Irene Adler, that still, after all these years, remained there. His voice dropped. That is what broke his illusion. Judith didn't follow his script. She saw her reflection and chose to be more than it. There was a knock at the door then, soft and uncertain. Mrs. Hudson poked her head in. "Pardon, Mr. Holmes, there's a visitor, Miss Witherton." Holmes turned at once. "Show her up, please." Moments later, Judith entered. She looked different, not merely better rested, but subtly transformed. The black mourning clothes had given way to a deep green coat with silver buttons, and she wore no hat. Her hair, previously bound in grief's austerity, now flowed freely down her back. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, glancing at both of us. "Not at all," Holmes replied, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "You are most welcome." She took the seat, her hands clasped neatly in her lap. "I came to thank you," she said, "not just for saving my life, though of course I owe you that, but for something else." Holmes waited. "For not letting him define me, for seeing me as more than a victim." "You defined yourself, Miss Witherton," he said gently. "I only noticed." She smiled. "That's very kind." There was a pause. Then she asked, "Did he leave anything behind?" "A message for you?" Holmes hesitated, then nodded. He withdrew a folded sheet from the inner pocket of his dressing gown and handed it to her. It was a small note, written in the same precise hand that had annotated all his sketches. "To Sherlock Holmes, the mirror is broken, but the audience still watches. The play is never over, only recast. V.D." Judith read it, then passed it back. "A warning?" "A boast," Holmes said, "and perhaps a prophecy, but it's over now." She stood. "I must go. There's an exhibition in Mayfair, a gallery showing Miles's early landscapes. I thought it would be difficult to attend, but now I think it might be exactly what I need." Holmes rose with her. He saw the world clearly, through reflection, yes, but also through compassion. It is a rare gift. Judith nodded once, then turned to me. "Dr. Watson, I've read your writing. You've always made Mr. Holmes larger than life, but it was comforting to see, in this case, that even mirrors can't capture the truth completely. You made me feel real." I was caught off guard. "That is very kind of you, Miss Witherton." She offered us both a faint smile, then departed, the sound of her steps soft against the hall. When she was gone, Holmes crossed once again to the fireplace. He stood there for some time, gazing into the dancing flames. "I wonder, Watson," he said eventually, "how many more plays are being rehearsed behind closed doors? How many more mirrors we must shatter? You can't predict them all." "No," he admitted. "But I can listen, watch. Look for the flicker of narrative in what seems like coincidence. It is always there." I picked up my pen again and opened the notebook to a fresh page. "What will you call this one?" Holmes asked. I thought for a moment. "The Murder in the Reflection," I said. He nodded once. "Fitting." We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the city began its bustle, horns, hooves, and hawkers filling the streets. Another London day. Holmes picked up his violin and played, not a dirge, nor a requiem, but a simple, thoughtful melody. A tune that neither haunted nor celebrated, but considered. A tune that echoed with the sound of glass being broken, illusions dismantled, and people choosing who they would become. And as the music filled the room, I wrote the final words of the case, not just the end of Drelincourt's cruel theatre, but of what it meant for those who had stared into the mirror and stepped away unchanged. We had witnessed a tragedy, but not everyone in it had been cast to die. And that, I decided, was the greatest deduction of all. It was some weeks later, as the last of the winter fog began to retreat, and the first true spring sunlight found its way through the windows of 221B Baker Street, that Holmes and I sat once more by the fire, the case of the murder in the Reflection now consigned. To memory and manuscript I had completed my account, which Holmes, true to form, had read in a single sitting and dismissed with a dry comment about my noble tendency to romanticize. Still I saw the faintest smile at the corners of his mouth as he replaced the pages upon my desk. "It is good," he said. "You've left nothing out." I tried to be thorough. "You were, and yet—" He trailed off, rising to retrieve one final document from the corner of his desk. It was a photograph, not of a crime scene, nor of any of the victims, but of the final mirror recovered from Drelincourt's Whitechapel studio. Though the glass had been shattered during our confrontation, one fragment had remained intact enough to preserve the image it had last reflected. Holmes had requested it be photographed by the yard before being stored away as evidence. He handed the photo to me now. "What do you see, Watson?" I examined it carefully. It showed the room, the broken chair, the gas lamp's flickering reflection, and Judith Witherton seated at its centre. But what caught my attention was not her image. It was the background. There, just over her left shoulder, in the blurred reflection of the mirror, was a figure, faint, indistinct, almost impossible to recognize. Almost. "Good Lord," I whispered. "It's him, Drelincourt." Holmes nodded. He positioned himself deliberately, Watson, not just for her, but for the mirror, for posterity. He made himself the final brush-stroke in his own composition. I stared at the ghost-like outline. He knew the mirror would survive. "No," Holmes said. He hoped it would, but in the event it didn't, he made sure the photograph would capture it instead, a last note in his symphony. There was silence for a while, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock and the distant rattle of hooves in the street below. Finally Holmes spoke again, softly, but with the quiet intensity that always preceded a truth. This case was never truly about murder, not in the conventional sense. It was about perception, about how easily we are led to accept the narrative we are shown so long as it is framed with care. Drelincourt's genius was not in killing, it was in curating meaning. And in the end, I said, he was caught by his own obsession. Yes. Holmes looked down at the photograph one last time. "Because he believed that mirrors always tell the truth. But they don't, Watson. They tell our truth, the one we bring with us when we look into them." He returned the photograph to the drawer and closed it gently. Drelincourt's theatre is gone. His curtain has fallen. But the lesson remains. I stood, stretching the stiffness from my shoulders. "And what is that lesson, Holmes?" He turned toward the window, his profile sharp against the spring sunlight. "That the most dangerous illusions," he said, "are not the ones crafted by criminals, but the ones we accept without question." He struck a match, lit his pipe, and resumed his seat. Outside, the fog was gone. The streets rang with life again, vendors calling, children laughing, the distant whistle of a constable at the corner. Inside, Holmes leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the smoke drift upward. The case was over. But the reflections, I thought, would never leave us entirely. Not in a world where every mirror, broken or whole, still waits patiently for someone to step into view and see only what they wish to see.